The title of your keynote in the conference will be Low Fertility is Not a Destiny, Trends, Determinants, and Policies. Okay, so first of all, I want to ask you to try to explain to us what do we mean by low fertility? Why is that a problem? Or at the moment, I was discussing a lot about that, especially for this country, I have to say. But what do we mean by low fertility, and when do you actually enter into that definition?
So demographers often think of low fertility as fertility which is below the so-called replacement level. Now, this is a very demographic construct. This is a level of fertility which would mean in the long term that population is not replacing itself, is shrinking under the conditions of stable mortality and no migration to the country. So it's a very theoretical construct, which in practice doesn't really work out like that in most countries. But if you take this construct, every woman in highly developed countries with low mortality would need to have something close to 2.1 kids on average, so something over 2 kids on average, to replace herself so that the population would remain stable in the long term. Of course, in practice, things are different. There is migration, mortality is changing, we are living ever longer lives. Population structure is also not very smooth, so this also determines how many kids are being born in different countries. And the question is also whether we really need to be concerned about fertility rates, which are around 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 kids per woman. And there I would argue this is not a real big reason to be worried or concerned, or whether we need to care about very low fertility levels because they signal that something is not working out fine in a given society. And then we are typically speaking about fertility levels below 1.5 kids per woman on average.
Right. So for many years, we've been concerned about the overpopulation, right? So the fact that the demographic trends are going too fast, or in some areas of the world, the population is growing really, really fast, and we are concerned about the use of resources, of course, and the level of sustainability, because the planet, we know, is really under strain at the moment. It's really facing a lot of crises, ecological crisis, climate crisis, and so on. So why are we concerned in Europe or in high-income countries about the low fertility?
So actually, often the concerns people have are very much related to the place where they live. So very few people think first of the planet or of a global level when they think of whatever is happening in terms of population trends, economic trends, social trends. So from this more localized, more regional perspective, it very much makes sense that people are more worried about low fertility, declining populations than about the overpopulation. So what it all means is that our world is becoming much more differentiated, that we now have regions which are clearly shrinking already now or have been shrinking in the last decades. And I can mention Southeastern European countries like Romania, Bulgaria, I can mention Moldova, I can mention the Baltic states. Then we have many countries and regions which are going to shrink relatively fast in the next decades. And there I can mention, for instance, the East Asian countries, including China. And we have countries and regions which would be shrinking already now if they didn't have substantial immigration. And there we are speaking also about Southern European countries, Italy, Spain, Greece, Malta. And for these regions, it of course makes sense that people are worried. What is going to happen in the long term? What will be the consequences of depopulation if it comes? How can we deal with accelerated pace of population aging? And when we zoom into Southern European countries, of course, Southern Europe next to East Asia is one of the two global hotspots of extreme low fertility rates, which are very low, whatever way we measure them. So there is no question whether it's just a period effect, whether this is affecting generations of women born in the 1970s, 60s, it's there. Whatever way we look at it, and we know it's not just because people would have preferences for very small families. We know that this is also a matter and a consequence of obstacles many people are facing when thinking about their family plans. And this is perhaps also one of the reasons why we should worry about very low fertility rates. Typically, they don't happen because people would be planning to have very small families. They often happen because people typically aspire to have 2 kids or something around 2 kids, and they face too many obstacles and too many issues when thinking of realizing these fertility plans. Southern European countries are exactly in this situation.
Right. So it's interesting in a way. I come from a strongly scientific background more than statistical or demographical and so on, right? So it seems to me, but maybe I'm wrong, I'm going to ask this. Are there impacts in terms of, again, if we look from the natural or biological or even urbanistic point of view, the possibility of granting like some indicators of high quality, like, for example, not to live in overcrowded cities and so on, or in less polluted cities and areas. Those kind of needs and maybe expectations seem to be contradicted with the idea that low fertility is an issue or a problem, right? So, but on the other side, then we have the social organization. So my question is this: is this problem of low fertility perceived as such because we have a social organization that is not necessarily reflecting the needs of the environment, and it's more reflecting the needs of the way our society has been built in the past generation?
I think your question is very complex, so it's not it's not easy to think where to start. Maybe let me start at a general level, saying once more that personally, and I can also back it up from some of the facts and findings, I don't think that moderately low fertility is a big issue. If fertility rates in our countries would be like around the average of the European Union level, say something like 1.6, 1.7 kids per woman, I don't think this is an issue because this doesn't bring very rapid population shrinking. In fact, in combination with immigration, which most of Europe is experiencing, this may even be combined with a moderate population increase or stable population in the long term. And it could indeed bring more focus on the quality of life we are living. I don't see really any need of pushing for an increase in our populations. There is, unless you are a nationalistic politician who wants to have more voters and more people of the same color, nation, whatever, religion, there is no real need of increasing our population size. But it is more worrying when we are dealing with countries where fertility is very low. And it's an interesting question whether we could make use of this very low fertility to think of our urban spaces, of our quality of life, of the ways we live. But the problem is that low fertility is often concentrated, or very low fertility is often concentrated in places where these questions are not very relevant. We are thinking of peripheral regions from which people are out migrating, and on the top of that, they have few kids. And these regions, towns, villages are simply losing too many people so that the infrastructure also starts deteriorating. Whereas even in very low fertility places like South Korea, many people love to move to big crowded cities. So low fertility doesn't necessarily improve the quality of life, because in Korea, it seems that half of the people want to live in Seoul. This is where jobs are, this is where nice salaries are, this is where all the social life is when there is no COVID. This is where the best universities are. And somehow very low fertility doesn't really solve this issue. So people end up again living in a very crowded place, with expensive housing, complaining that they cannot afford to have a flat to build their family.
Right. Well, that's an issue. Of course, it's not all easy to be to combine these different needs and make sure that they go along together, right? So which are the most important factors that are actually affecting fertility, and where are the policies coming in? Are policies one issue? I'm sure, but also which are other factors?
So there are many factors, of course, which policies cannot impact much. And to name just a few, the fact that we have a very good control over our fertility decisions is one of the reasons behind low fertility. We don't have many unplanned kids anymore. We don't have many unwanted kids anymore. There is good contraception. Most countries have very good access to abortion, or many rich countries, highly developed countries have access to abortion. So most of the kids, and that's actually good news, are planned and wanted kids. And this is one of the reasons why we don't see a fertility of 2.5 or 3 kids on average, but we are below 2. People have different preferences. They face different obstacles in their lives. And to make some sense of all these conflicting preferences and plans, to deal with different preferences of their partners, or with the fact that often they don't have a right partner, means that fertility is also being increasingly delayed to ever later points in life. And this happens in countries with good policies, like Sweden. It happens in countries with relatively less developed policies, like Spain or Italy. It happens in countries with almost no policies, like the US. Everywhere people want to have kids later in life, when they are more economically secure, when they have a steady partner, when they feel ready for parenthood, when they don't want to do all the other exciting things they can do in life. And this also means that the window of having kids in the reproductive period of the people is getting shorter and narrower. And some people may miss the target because they try too late, or they don't find that fantastic partner, or the partner doesn't want. So these are many things which already explain quite a bit why fertility is slow in many of our countries. But then on the top of that, of course, are all the things where policies can help. One very big area where policies may matter to some extent is economic insecurity. If people are facing permanent uncertainty on the labor market, high unemployment, bad wages, inability to put a foothold on the labor market, to find a good job, this creates a massive sense of uncertainty and really makes many of them putting parenthood until later. So if you have countries with dysfunctional economy, a dysfunctional labor market, this is one of the big factors why people postpone parenthood or don't have many kids. And then you have things where policies can address even much more, starting from housing availability, through financial support to families, up to all the ways how we can combine our jobs, careers, and our family lives. That means good conditions when parents are on parental leave, a lot of flexibility with taking parental leave, a lot of flexibility in terms of work hours, combining work and having kids, and of course, childcare availability. That's one of the very key things, especially for kids below the age of 3. So all these things, they are there, and for different couples. Of course, this is a very different situation. Everyone has different preferences and different conditions in life. But I would argue that good family-friendly societies with decent welfare support for families need to support all these pillars: financial support for families, very good conditions on parental leave, also well financially supported, and childcare availability. Finally, maybe I could mention also the issue of gender inequalities, which is very prominent in demographic discussions. It seems that fertility is higher in countries where men are participating more in child rearing and in household organization, but also where men feel more responsible for overall supporting their families, and maybe where it is taken for granted that women also have their careers. So once societies are able to provide these conditions, then of course it's much easier for women, but also for couples to decide to have a child. There are societies which are really very gender unequal, where all the burden of the childcare falls upon women, and there are all these expectations what women should do to raise their children properly. And I can go back again to South Korea as one quite extreme example, as well as Japan, of such gender unequal society. There is no surprise that many women decide not even to marry, so that they don't get into this package of marrying and having a child, withdrawing from the labor market and devoting themselves just to their fantastic child.
I have two more questions if you have a few more minutes with me. So the first question is, coming from the country I come from, we have a demographic pyramid, which is really like that, right? So like we have a lot more elderly and increasingly, okay, apart from the impact of the recent pandemic, we know we have lost some life expectancy in terms of the length of life that someone is expected to live. But apart from that, we still have a country which has a smaller part of the population around the age of, or lower than the age of 25, let's say, and then we have a lot of population which is over 60. And my question is very simple, but I think it's still very important to remind people if a structure like this is desirable or not, which are the impacts of a structure like that, because independent from the fact that we rebalance the situation by having more kids like born in Italy or kids that are coming from other places. The thing is, a society that's mainly focusing on really having this big part of the population, I can't remember the percentages now, but having such a strong percentage of the population over 60 compared to below 25, which are the advantages and which are the concerns or the impacts of such a structure?
Maybe to start from the concerns somehow combined with the advantages, I think that it creates some opportunities to try things in a different way. But the trouble is that I think Italian governments have not been really doing, changing the society in the ways which would be more feasible to properly cope with this demographic challenge. To name a few things, if you have a rapidly aging society, it's very important to think of the ways how to keep people longer in the labor market. It's very important to think of the ways how to make a better use of women's human capital, to create good jobs for women and keep women in the labor market. It's very important to think of intergenerational balance, how to provide resources not only for supporting the older population, which has a lot of needs. So it's clear that a lot of resources have to go for retirement pensions, healthcare, social care for the elderly, no question about that. But it's equally important that the government has a budget to support younger generations so that they can get a decent housing, so that they can get decent jobs, decent job training. And I think in many of these respects, Italy has been quite failing because people are still retiring relatively early, especially the highly educated ones, given their qualification. Women's participation in the labor market is one of the lowest in Europe, at least if you think of formal employment. Of course, there is a lot of gray employment, which is not reported, but the formal employment, women are doing really bad. And young people are faring very badly on the labor market and in their life opportunities. This is a challenge when things are not really working out the way they should in a society. The opportunity perhaps could be that I think Italian men and women around age 60 and 70 are among the healthiest 60s and 70s years old men and women around Europe. So this really gives some hope that they will be living their elderly years in relatively decent conditions. Italy has this very strong familistic culture, which maybe also helps because this somehow binds generations together. So some of the young are still getting a lot of help from the elderly generations, but I think families are also making the aging process for many of the elderly much nicer through keeping all these social ties, helping them through keeping the social network. And the elderly, of course, care for the grandchildren very often as well. And I think the other point which has to be taken more seriously is how migration can also change this. All rich countries in Europe have immigration. There is almost no exception. Of course, there are periods like economic crises when immigration dries up, but this is temporary. In the long term, be it Italy, be it Spain, be it Sweden, be it Czech Republic and Austria, we will all face a lot of interest of smart people, educated people, and also less educated people who want to come to our countries and make an economic contribution. Maybe people have too few kids, but that's one thing. But if there are many migrants who are willing to come when they are 20, 25, settle in our countries and make an economic contribution and maybe start their family, I think we need to start thinking about proper ways how to regulate immigration, not by saying we close the doors, we don't allow it, but how to think about a balance, how to say or discuss what kind of migrants are we very happy to accept, what kind of migrants are we less happy to accept, under which conditions, but also how to make them easier to settle in the country for long term, how to make them easier to really feel parts of the country after 5-10 years, and not somehow to be able to make the contribution to the country over the long-term period. Because many countries, many governments are putting their heads in the sand. They just don't want to discuss the issue. And when they don't want to discuss the issue, then Canada is getting the best talent. Australia, when it's open, is getting the best talent because they have a points-based system of immigration, sucking in the best educated people. And in Europe, we are just making ad hoc decisions about what do we do with all these immigrants.
Right, and connected to what you said, like in this answer, the intergenerational balance, my last question is on that. Again, can you tell me if it's only a perception maybe, or if data supports the fact in Italy, my perception, I mean, just by observing the data, is that we've been elongating the time between one generation and another, right? So for example, between my grandmother and my mother, there were 20 years of age, and then between my mother and me, 30, and between me and my son, 39. So we're going like that, right? And how is that kind of structure going to affect the way the population is dealing with the issue of like being capable of keeping a structure, or keeping a working structure, a functional structure, sorry. So because I suppose there are very big differences if you have 4 generations in the space of 80 years and if you have only 2 generations in the space of 80 years. So first of all, my question is this difference very prominent in different countries, or can you observe trends in different countries? And then is this difference having an effect on the way the population is looking ahead at its future?
As I mentioned, in all countries, the age at parenthood has been increasing in the last 3, 4, sometimes even 5 decades. And Italy and Spain are actually at the forefront of this process. So when you mention big generation gap among the youngest generation and the next generation in Italy, this is a good illustration of the fact that Italy and Spain have been the most prominent first countries, together with the Netherlands and few others, in driving this trend of having kids ever later in life. Now, there are some good things about that. If you think, for instance, that we really need to support women in staying in the labor force a little bit longer, as long as their health allows that. Let's think of 65, 66, 68 years of age. From that perspective, it makes sense to have a bigger gap between generations. If you think that these women would once like to enjoy being grandmothers and taking care of their grandchildren, because if the generation distance is too small, they would become grandmothers when they are 45, 50, 55. They would be working for another 10, 15, 20 years. And either they would feel a pressure to stop working and start being grandmothers on a full-time basis, or they might feel sorry for not spending so much time with their grandchildren. So from some perspectives, a bigger gap makes sense. Also from the fact that we are living longer and longer lives. So when people were often dying in their 50s or 60s, it also kind of makes sense that the gap between generations is shorter, because of course they come much earlier in life to the age when they need someone else to take care of them, and this wouldn't be possible if their kids are 15 or 20 years old. So from all this perspective, lengthening lives, delayed education, it makes sense that we have kids later in life. But of course, there is a clash then with individual life courses. Some people get sick when they are 50. Some people get in a sandwich situation. You have your kids when you are 45, 50, and suddenly you see you need to care for your kids, and your parents start needing you. And so more people will also happen to be in this sandwich situation, that there are demands on both sides, caring for their kids and caring for their parents. But this is going to be very individual, really depending on health of the elderly. So this really is very individual, and we are super unequal in this. So then I cannot say well how on balance this will play out with this lengthening gap between generations.